All right, what's going on, everyone? So yesterday, U.S. President Trump laid out a possible proposal for Ukraine that, if put in place, could drastically change the direction of this war. I'm going to talk about what that is and why Russia's not super happy about it. We've got a, for lack of a better term, conspiracy that was floating around the internet yesterday. Unfortunately, got a lot of traction. We're going to break that down piece by piece and then dive into a few other articles and headlines to give you an idea of what's going on around the war in Ukraine. Now, starting with a battlefield update here, this is Deep State Map. This and all of the resources and articles referenced in today's video will be linked in the description below. Now, the majority, there's been, of course, constant fighting all across the front, no major change there. In terms of changes to the situation on the battlefield, though, right here in the southeastern portion, so south of Pokrovsk, northeast of Velika Novoselka, we've got this pocket forming west of Kharkov. My apologies in the pronunciation here. Russia's moving through a lot of these small towns that most of us have never heard of before, and we're just trying to pronounce for the first time as they're entering the line of contact. Now, just a few days ago, Russia did take full control over this area here, Velika Novoselka. Not necessarily strategically important, but this is an area that Ukraine, during the course of their summer counteroffensive in 2023, did take some of this territory. So this was Russia recapturing some of that land. This cauldron here is getting a lot of attention in Russian media right now. And part of the reason is it looks like they're starting to close this off to the side. Again, stepping back, this is something that we're seeing by and large across the front with Russia. We're seeing far fewer essentially direct assaults trying to push forward as far as possible, and quite a few more cauldrons forming around certain areas, right? And you can zoom in and see this kind of at the micro level, and then zoom out and see it more at the macro level, where it's happening around some of these larger areas that are pretty well defended by Ukrainian forces. So the issue here right now is there are a fair number of Ukrainian forces in here. Dokhny, again, my apologies in the pronunciation. Russia has put out quite a few notes about how this has been pretty well defended, and the Ukrainian forces there are inflicting pretty significant losses on the Russians attacking. Again, one entrance and exit, and at this point, if we just look at how far away some of these forces are from the road, that's probably in 2 kilometers there. So we're talking about bordering on direct fire, 2.23 kilometers. But if we come over here a little bit further, it's got to be even closer, right? I feel like I didn't measure that correctly. 1.8 kilometers there. There we go. So, heavier weapons that would be in direct fire range, but either way, definitely within range of anti-tank guided missiles and, of course, drones, which are becoming a bigger and bigger problem as they're attached to fiber optic cables, kind of bypassing Ukrainian electronic warfare. So right now, this pocket west of Kharkov is becoming an issue for Ukraine. And of course, the major issue along the front right now is Pokrovsk. If Pokrovsk were to fall, that would be a significant negative impact to Ukraine's ability to continue to hold a wide portion of the Eastern Front. Now, shifting over to this Trump plan that just came out yesterday, he essentially offered Ukraine's rare earth minerals in exchange for U.S. military aid. And the reactions I saw to this were a lot of Ukrainians and Ukraine supporters saying, great, where do we sign up? And I'll show you why here in a second. But the exact words here was Trump said, quote, "We're telling Ukraine that they have very valuable rare earth. We want to guarantee," Trump told reporters, referring to the crucial minerals for high-tech components. "We're handing them money hand over fist. We're giving them equipment. We're looking to do a deal with Ukraine where they're going to secure what we're going to give them with their rare earth and other things." And I'll go through all of this and kind of touch on a few of these subjects specifically. Trump also repeated his accusation that Europe is not keeping up with us in supporting Ukraine, demanding that they should be paying at least equal. "We have an ocean in between. They don't. It's more important for them than it is for us," Trump said. So I'm going to hit on that piece first, and then we're going to come back into the rare earth aspect of this. So right here, this piece, Europe should be paying at least equal. There is a resource for anybody interested to look at the Ukraine aid. It's published under the Kiel Institute. It's this Ukraine support tracker here. And I feel like there's been a lot of misconception, and this is something we're going to go into here in a moment with just a blatantly misleading statement from a commentator here in the United States. But Europe has been spending more than the United States when it comes to Ukraine. So that's this chart here on the upper right. The dark blue is the aid that has been allocated. It's already been spent in some way, shape, or form. The light gray is what is set aside but not yet allocated, committed to this cause, if you will. So when you group all of Europe, their collective spending is greater than that of the United States. Where it ends up getting a little more finicky is when you talk about the military aid aspect. By and large, the European Union and European countries are contributing more financially to kind of help support the Ukrainian state, whereas the United States, I mean, just look at this here, is for the most part contributing more on a military basis, which isn't crazy when you think about it. I mean, we have the larger military of anyone in Europe. So if we're going to be pulling from, if somebody's going to be pulling from a military to support this cause, it's probably going to be us. But even in terms of military aid, I believe the United States is outpacing Europe as a whole. But when you look at the overall contributions to the cause of supporting Ukraine, Europe, as it sits today, is outpacing the United States. Now, turning over to those rare earth minerals, I'm not a geologist, I'm not an expert in this stuff, and I'm not an economist, which we'll get to here in a second in the back half of this video. So we're going to look to some people who know more about that than I do. Geo Insider seems like somebody who's tied into this space. And there's a couple different things that they hit on here. They said, according to Forbes' estimate for 2023, the total value of minerals in Ukraine reaches up to $15 trillion, but more than 70% of the total amount falls in three regions, Donetsk, Dnipro, and Luhansk. So real quick, Donetsk, Dnipro, Luhansk. Pulling up a map here. Donetsk, Dnipro, Luhansk. The problem here that some of those are currently occupied by Russian forces. All right, now moving back into this. Before the full-scale war, Ukraine was a significant supplier of steel, titanium, lithium, gallium, iron ore, and manganese to Europe. However, this was disrupted. Russian aggression may have been motivated in part by a desire to control Ukraine's large reserve of critical minerals, which are strategically important for the production of advanced green energy technologies. And there's a couple maps here in Ukrainian, so, can't go through this as easily as I can, something in English, but you can see these three areas here, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Dnipro, with the largest areas of rare earth deposits. And there was another chart here that I thought did a good job. Alexander Kochorov published this. I'll pull this up full screen, showing the locations of the minerals overlaid with the territory that Russia has occupied since 2014, and then some of this since 2022. So what we're seeing in a lot of responses to this are Ukrainians saying, you want that stuff? Great. Help us regain that territory, and we'll gladly sign some sort of rights to the United States to have access to or ownership of those materials. Because, I mean, it sounds like a win-win for Ukraine, right? Now, the interesting piece here in this whole conversation about mineral resources is it's kind of a mask-off moment if this is something that is genuine, if that makes sense. So I have been critical in the past of the United States, talking about how the only reason that we're in Ukraine is to uphold democracy and to fight for what is right and to fight back against evil. I have said that I don't think that flies. It doesn't land. Like, it feels good, sure, but we're not risking lives, or in this case, money and equipment, and in other cases, lives to be good, right? There's always some intrinsic value to us. So if the value here really is these rare earth minerals, first off, it's not something the United States has outright said that I can find anywhere, all right? So if it is, kind of a mask off for the United States, but it puts Russia in this tough spot where they're looking at it. They have never mentioned this as we're taking Ukraine because of their resources, because that is directly a war of imperialism, right? And that's very hard to get your country behind, even today, even Russia. So it's other things, right? It's the security of the Russian people, and it's the Russian heritage. And, well, Ukraine doesn't actually legitimately exist, even as a state, and we have to protect our people, right? Oh, denazification, all these different things you got to throw out there. So what's interesting with this most recent assessment proposal by Trump is Russia is forced to look at this and say, no, you can't have those are ours, but that's not why we're there. Just happens. It's all these other reasons that we're there. It's not the minerals, but you can't have them. We took those fair and square. So this is going to be interesting, because this proposal by Trump is hands down the most, I don't want to say pro-Ukraine, but it is the biggest thing to come out of this administration, or even the last administration, that would clearly demonstrate strong support for Ukraine in exchange for something, right? They're going to need a lot of help to push Russia out of those territories, and this is the only time I've ever seen something brought forward that seems to be hinting at that. So interesting one there. I'm sure we're going to hear more about that. Then this was a delight over on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling it today. So this is one of those things that you want to just ignore and brush aside. But unfortunately, if you look at this, 5.3 million views. So, deep down, I think, people want to hear the accurate information and genuine and like try to sift through the noise to understand what's going on. And then something like this comes out and like, maybe not. So anyways, this guy, Gunther Engelman, said, holy shit, we were right again. Zelensky claims Ukraine only received $75 billion of the over $177 billion sent in aid. Where did the money go? The American media will never share this. Make it viral. The American media won't share it because this is made up or horribly misinterpreted at best. Let's go ahead and play, just so we have some context here, the actual clip that he posted of Zelensky in an interview just a couple days ago.
Дивіться, я коли чую, і раніше чув, і сьогодні ми чуємо від Сполучених Штатів Америки, що Америка дала Україні сотні мільярдів, 177, якщо сказати більш точно. Така звучала точна цифра, яку підтримували або голосував Конгрес, тощо різні організації. Дивіться, я як президент воюючої країни вам говорю, ми отримали більше 75. Тобто 100 мільярдів з цих 177, або 200, говорять навіть деякі люди, ми ніколи не отримували. І це важливо. Бо ми говоримо про конкретні речі, бо ми отримали це не грошима, а зброєю. Ми зброю отримали на 70 з чимось мільярдів. Є навчання, тренування, є додатковий транспорт, є не тільки ціну на зброю, були гуманітарні програми, соціальні тощо. Але коли говорять, що Україна під час війни отримала 200 мільярдів на підтримку армії тощо, це неправда. Я не знаю, де всі ці гроші.
All right, so now you've seen the entire thing. That's the clip, start to finish, longer interview, but that's the piece that people are cherry picking to say, oh my God, there's $100 billion missing. Zelensky said it himself. If only there was a way we could dig into this a little bit, and there was some sort of accountability for there it is, Ukraine oversight. There's a website for this, I guess, that's publicly available. Seems like this is usually just passed over. But either way, let's go ahead and start here. Seems like a good place to dig into some of those claims. Right here, it says the U.S. Ukraine response funding totals $183 billion, with $130 obligated and $86 billion dispersed. So what Zelensky is saying is that the United States talks this game about the 180, he says $177 billion. We've only received 74, 75, 77 of it. He's saying it has not all been distributed, not that there is some number missing. So in this case, they're saying, yeah, the United States, our oversight website that is publicly available, as of now at least, $86 billion has been dispersed. Now, I understand how you might look at that and say, wait a minute, there's still like a $10 billion difference. That's a problem. I would agree. I'm an American taxpayer. I want to make sure that every single cent that we spend in taxes is allocated appropriately, right? Like zero waste is the idea here. Now, when you look at that $86 billion and Zelensky says, well, I've only received $74 billion or something like that, we'll just scroll up a little bit here. And it turns out that this includes funding. Let's see. These packages include security assistance for NATO allies and other partner nations, funding to support enhanced U.S. military presence and activity in Europe, and replenishment of U.S. military stocks transferred to the Ukrainian armed forces. Zelensky's never going to see any of that. Like, at no point in this story is Zelensky going to see $186 billion of value, ever. Right? A ton of that is being spent here in the United States. He might see the value in terms of military equipment showing up in his country. He's probably not going to see the value of the money we spend on NATO exercises or the deployments of our troops overseas to places like Poland, Europe, wherever it might be, or the money we spend on training programs that take place in Germany, for instance. The challenge that we're still running into here, and it is so frustrating in a lot of ways, is the argument is still being presented by so many people that we're spending like this cold hard cash in Ukraine, that there's $183 billion in $100 bills arriving in Ukraine. That has never been the case, but unfortunately, we still see some accounts with a lot of followers and a lot of views making that suggestion. And again, when you see this, just remind folks that there is a website they can go to, ukraineoversight.gov. They can dig into all of the congressional reports, exactly the investigations on where things have been spent, oversight dashboards, where the funding is coming from. You might think that it's not enough, or it could be more, or it's just not good at baseline. But I think with a lot of these arguments, it would at least be good to start on the common ground of acknowledging the accurate data, if you will. Maybe that's a bridge too far. Who knows? Now, another hot topic that came up this week was the argument about Ukraine holding elections during wartime. I made a video about this just a couple days ago. My personal opinion is that it's a lose-lose situation for Ukraine. One of the pushes right now for them to hold elections is Putin is saying Zelensky is not legitimate. He was supposed to be out of power in May, this past May, I think it was. They have not held elections because they're under martial law, and that would be in violation of their constitution. So Putin is looking at this saying, we can't have any sort of negotiated settlement with a president that is not legitimate, because it makes that agreement illegitimate. That's the Putin stance. The problem is Ukraine is really in a catch-22 here. So it is, I'm not going to say impossible. I will say very, very, very challenging for Ukraine to pull off a free, fair, representative election in the middle of a war, because they have missiles and bombs raining down on their cities all across the country every single day. They've got millions of displaced people across Europe, millions living under Russian occupation in portions of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory that would not have any viable way to vote, and you've got 1 million plus soldiers directly involved in combat operations. On top of that, you have to think about how are they going to campaign? Who's going to campaign? What is that going to look like in a time of war? There's a reason that in their constitution, martial law says no elections. Let's wait until this is over, and then we'll get back to it. So that's been a hot topic over the last couple days, and this article in Politico called out a couple things that were interesting. This was the core of it. They said over the weekend, United States President Donald Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, said, quote, in most democracies, elections take place even during wartime. I think it's important. I believe it's good for democracy. The beauty of a strong democracy is having more than one potential candidate. And then you have to take this with a grain of salt because it's coming from an anonymous source, but they quoted a former Ukrainian minister who said, quote, the alignment on elections between Washington and Moscow is worrisome. I see it as the first evidence that Trump and Putin agree that they want Zelensky out. Now, this is an interesting piece here, again, because I'm never going to argue against elections, especially if the people of that country are calling for them. But an interesting thing when looking at Ukraine right now is the people there, like on the ground, living day in and day out throughout this war, they are not calling for elections. In fact, they'd rather wait until this war is over. So the push for them to hold presidential elections in this time of war, in a time where, the voting systems could be easily compromised by Russia or try to be influenced by Russia. And all Russia needs is right now, again, remember, they're calling Zelensky illegitimate. Think of all of the little things that could go wrong during an election in wartime with a bunch of the population displaced and missiles falling all over the country. Think of how little it would take for Russia to say that's not a legitimate outcome. So now we don't recognize this new person. So from Ukraine's perspective, they're probably like, well, there's no way we can win here. And also, who is Putin, an authoritarian dictator, to look at any other country and talk about free and fair elections, which is kind of funny in itself. Now, looking at a recent poll by the International Republican Institute, this was just a couple months ago, they asked Ukrainian citizens about, do you want an election right now? And right here at the bottom, elections for the president of Ukraine, they've got 36 that are in favor of an election today. But, oh man, I messed up math live last time I did it. 60% opposed to it. So again, this argument about they have to hold elections, they must hold elections, it's very much an external force at this point. Even the people of Ukraine recognize that that probably isn't a good idea right now, which it's interesting that there's so much external pressure. And if I were Ukrainian, I'd probably be a little bit upset by that because it is taking away some of their agency to try to force them into a process that they themselves don't think is a good step forward right now as it sits. That said, every poll that I've seen, every Ukrainian I've seen interviewed on this subject says the minute the war is over, 100% elections right away. And it probably won't even be Zelensky that wins. Zaluzhny, supposedly the former head of the Ukrainian military, from what I've seen in recent polls, tends to be a little bit ahead of Zelensky. So, Either way, that, again, hot button issue popping up this week. Amidst all of that, Ukraine has continued their drone attacks, long-range drone attacks against Russian oil infrastructure. This has really been kind of the Ukrainian aspect, the Ukrainian way of fighting this war. When we go back to the battlefield, you're seeing a lot of gains by Russia in a lot of places. They're slow. They're costing Russia a lot of equipment, a lot of manpower, and a lot of time. Like at the current pace, it's going to be, you've seen some of these calculations before, like 17 years before they actually reach Kyiv kind of thing at the cost of 73 million people or something crazy. So it's incredibly slow, incredibly costly, but Russia is making progress essentially all across the front. The Ukrainian aspect of this war is they're whittling away at Russia's ability to wage the war long term. And one of the ways they're going about doing this are these long-range drone strikes against the Russian oil infrastructure. The Kyiv Post published this just a couple days ago. This was from all of January 2025. That's a lot of strikes. And to give you an idea where some of these are taking place, like on this map, you can see some of these are well past Moscow, right? The distance that these drones would have to fly without being intercepted, without being identified in some cases, and still able to cause damage deep inside of Russia. It's a significant new innovation by Ukraine that I feel like has largely been underappreciated in the United States. Russia appreciates it. Their mill bloggers are furious about this, wondering what on earth is happening to where the war got to the point where places east of Moscow are sucking up drones left and right. But there have been a lot of these in recent days, but we have to be careful that the takeaway from this is not that the Russian economy is on the verge of collapse, because we've heard that before. It's been a talking point for a long time. You go back to the opening days of the war, that was a debate. And RUSI, the Royal United Service Institute, a British think tank, just put out a really good article. I guess this was about 2 weeks ago now, right in the midst of all of these drone strikes on the oil infrastructure, saying Russia's wartime economy isn't as weak as it looks. Now, I said it before, I'll say it again, and I'll probably say it many other times in future videos. I'm not an economist. Most of the detailed economic data, way over my head. So I'm going to kind of move through some of that, but there's some key points here that I wanted to highlight. And again, if you want to dig further into this data, it will be linked in the description below. So where was the... Here we go. Talking about the possibility that the long-term economic impact could be detrimental to the Russian war effort. They say, sadly, these hopes are likely to prove misplaced. Russia's economy has confounded expectations throughout the war, and despite suffering several complications, remains well-placed to support the Kremlin's ambitions in Ukraine and beyond. Doesn't mean that the economy is not going to hurt or that there could be some impact, more just the idea that if you're watching this and saying that this is going to be the thing that grinds the Russian war machine to a halt, don't hold your breath. They say, unfortunately, hopes of an imminent economic crisis are unlikely to be realized. Although Russia undoubtedly faces significant challenges, there is little to suggest that there will result in any significant political consequence that might prompt the Kremlin to rein in its ambitions in Ukraine. And there are a couple really interesting points here. They say even the extent to which Russia has a war economy is exaggerated. While the broad NATO measure of military expenditure is likely to account for 40% of Russian federal spending this year, this will amount to closer to 20% of Russia's consolidated state spending. Although this is high, it's comparable to U.S. military spending during the Vietnam War. The militarization of the economy has undoubtedly grown. However, it remains well below the crippling levels observed in the hyper-militarized Soviet economy. Importantly, many of the features of true war economies, such as price controls, the centralized allocation of resources, and widespread nationalization of private sector assets, have yet to appear in Russia. And then the last piece here that I really wanted to hammer home was talking about how, despite all of this happening, it's not good for Russia, right? You see a lot of Russian mill bloggers talk about, kind of brag about how the Russian economy is better than ever. That's a bit of a stretch. They're making it through this. They've definitely sustained some damage. They're surviving. I don't know that a lot of the growth metrics are manipulated based off of sanctions and a lot of other currency issues, things like that. But they say Russia is unlikely to join the ranks of high-income countries anytime soon. However, the country's poor long-term prognosis should not lead us to overlook its short-term resilience. Throughout its 500-year history, Russia's economic system has rarely delivered broad-based growth or economic-wide innovation for long. Instead, the needs of the market have usually been subordinated to the needs of the state, often to enable the Kremlin to pursue security-related objectives. That feels like exactly what is happening right now. They say today's system is no different, designed to ensure that the Kremlin can pursue a sovereign foreign policy against the interests. They say today's system is no different, designed to ensure that the Kremlin can pursue a sovereign foreign policy against the interests of the collective West. It is doing its job. The market is strong enough to give the system adaptability and dynamism, and the state is strong enough to ensure that sufficient resources are mobilized towards achieving its security objectives. For as long as this equilibrium remains intact, Russia will be able to generate the necessary economic resources to sustain enough military power to wage war in Ukraine and over the long term to rearm for a prolonged confrontation with the West. Any hopes that its economic vulnerabilities will bring it to the negotiating table are therefore unlikely to be realized. And a couple notes there. I think one thing to consider is that this is as the current economic warfare standard has been implemented today. Maybe there's some new features that can be unveiled during the Trump administration that maybe expedites some of the issues to the Russian economy. This is kind of backwards looking as to what is in place now and using that data to project forward, saying, based off what we've seen so far, they're not going to collapse anytime soon. Of course, if there's a major change in the sanctions regime or anything like that, it of course could signal a significant change to the future of the Russian economy. But that's all I've got for now. Again, if interested in any of this information, all of these articles and resources will be linked in the description below. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.